Making America, Chapter 3, Founding the English Mainland Colonies, 1585 to 1732. Individual choices, Nathaniel Bacon. Arriving in Virginia from England in 1674, Nathaniel Bacon was wealthy enough to buy a tobacco plantation near Jamestown and a large tract of land on the frontier. Governor William Berkeley, impressed with the young man, appointed him to his elite advisory council. But within 2 years, Bacon had become the governor's worst nightmare, the leader of a rebellion by frontier farmers and servants. What drove Bacon to rebel, and what caused so many frontiersmen to join him? Hard times had come to the back country. A drought coupled with falling tobacco prices threatened to destroy these farmers' dreams of prosperity. It had become harder to pay the taxes imposed by the Virginia government, and few of the wealthy planters who monopolized the coastal land seemed willing to provide relief for their struggling fellow colonists. Above all, Bacon and his followers resented that the government refused to use some of the money it collected to keep the backcountry safe from Indian attacks. Like most colonists who would move west, these Virginians had little sympathy for the native population they were uprooting. Things came to a head when Bacon demanded that the governor raise a militia to rid the backcountry of Indians. When the governor refused, Bacon took matters into his own hands. He raised a vigilante army that attacked peaceful as well as hostile Indian villages. Enraged, Governor Berkeley branded Nathaniel Bacon a traitor, but to his neighbors, General Bacon was a hero. Over 500 men and women flocked to his defense, and together they seized control of the colony's capital. Soon the rebel army controlled over 2/3 of Virginia, but on October 26, 1676, their leader died suddenly of dysentery. Without the charismatic Bacon, the revolution faltered, and by the spring of 1677, it had been crushed. Before his death, Bacon wrote the Declaration of the People, excerpted at the end of this chapter. In it, he declared that he and his followers were fighting for a just cause. The royal governors and the wealthy coastal planters who dominated Virginia's political life over the next century disagreed. To these elite colonists, Bacon and his rebellion symbolized a dangerous breakdown of law and order. To Native Americans, Bacon represented the dangers of land-hungry Europeans, but to backcountry families, he remained a folk hero. Bacon's rebellion reflects many of the contradictory themes and patterns of the 17th century English-American world. Colonists struggled to adapt creatively to new circumstances, yet they also worked to preserve old traditions and values. Their strong connections to their homelands came out in such small things as naming their towns or farms after places and people they'd left behind. Most colonists dreamed of farming their own land, yet to do this, they often callously uprooted Native American communities. Many colonists came to America seeking religious freedom, but in several colonies, this freedom was denied to members of other faiths. Most colonists dreamed of new economic opportunities, yet men of wealth, power, and prestige soon dominated colonial society. In every colony, conflict and violence went hand in hand with cooperation and community building because differences of religion, race, and social class divided neighbor from neighbor. Finally, despite 3,000 miles of ocean separating their new world from the old world, colonists were still affected by the political upheavals of their home countries and the great imperial struggles waged between Spain, France, Holland, and England. The early colonial settlements suffered many hardships. Ships carrying colonists sank in ocean storms or fell victim to pirates or enemy vessels. Diseases unknown in England decimated some of the new settlements, and poor planning and simple ignorance of survival techniques destroyed others. Conflicts with local Indian populations produced violence, bloodshed, and atrocities on both sides, and struggles between backcountry settlers like Bacon's rebels and the more established coastal residents erupted in New England, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and Virginia. Still, by the end of the 17th century, 12 distinct colonies hugged the Atlantic coastline of English America. The 13th colony, Georgia, was founded in 1732. Although each colony had its own unique history, the New World's climate and geography produced 4 distinct regions. I would write these down in your notes and make sure you know how they are different. There's New England, the Middle Colonies, the Upper South, and the Lower South. The colonies within each region shared a common economy and labor system, or a similar religious heritage, or a special character that defined the population, such as ethnic diversity. Yet certain institutions emerged in every colony. Thus, whether its founders had been religious refugees or wealthy businessmen, each colony developed a representative assembly, established courts, built houses of worship, and constructed jails. Carolinians may have thought they shared little in common with the people of Connecticut, for example, but both sets of colonists were subject to English law, English trade policies, internal English conflicts, and conflicts with rival nations. Separate but linked, they were part of a larger transatlantic world that joined Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Between 1607, the founding of Jamestown, and 1700, each of the colonies transformed itself from a struggling settlement to a complex society. It matters today, exploring new worlds then and now. When Sir Walter Raleigh declared his intention to create a colony in North America, many people no doubt thought the idea was foolish. The mysterious disappearance of his Roanoke Island colonists seemed to confirm that Raleigh was a dreamer. Yet today there is talk of colonizing the moon and perhaps even Mars. This is not just the work of science fiction novels or movies. In 2006, President George W. Bush announced plans to plant a colony on the moon, and in 2012, presidential hopeful Newt Gingrich pledged he would do so if elected to office. Even the U.S. space agency NASA has a proposal for a project called Moonbase. The quest to explore and settle new worlds seems to be alive and well in the 21st century. If you want, you can research physical conditions on the moon and list some of the challenges these would pose for colonists. You can produce a set of criteria for participation in such a colony, or, given differences in technology and economic and political sophistication between Raleigh's time and today, which venture seems more difficult, Roanoke or the Moon Colony? England and colonization. Considering the question, what circumstances or conditions in England affected people's willingness to join England's colonizing efforts? Unlike France or Spain, the English government was not willing to finance the creation of an American empire. No conquering army and no church-supported missionaries would be provided to aid colonists hoping to settle along the North American coastline. Instead, the crown relied on private citizens to take on risks of colonization. Sometimes the king helped by providing huge grants of land to the risk-takers, but the royal treasury was not tapped to create the 13 colonies that eventually emerged on the mainland. England's first attempts at colonization. When the poet and courtier Sir William Raleigh took up the challenge of colonization, he risked his personal fortune. In 1587, Raleigh financed the settlement of 100 colonists at Roanoke, the island he had chosen off the coast of what became North Carolina. Unfortunately, by 1588, England was locked in naval warfare with Spain. Remember, that's the year the Armada goes down, and Raleigh was unable to send supplies to his colony for over 3 years. When a supply ship finally reached Roanoke, the men on board could find no trace of the colonists. Instead, they found abandoned ruins and a single word carved into the bark of a nearby tree, Croatan. Whether the Roanoke colonists had fled from an attack by the Croatan Indians, been murdered by them, or rescued by them in the face of starvation, epidemic, or some other natural disaster, nobody knew. But news of the mysterious disappearance of the colonies spread rapidly. So too did news that Sir Walter Raleigh's wealth had disappeared in the process. It would be almost 16 years before anyone else dared to establish an English colony in North America. And for the record, recent genetic evidence suggests that the colonists at Roanoke did in fact intermarry with the local native population. So we think that we might know what happened to the colonists at Roanoke now. Turmoil and tensions in England. Nobody's ever going to know what crisis the Roanoke settlers faced, but the crises plaguing those still living in England in the 17th century were all too clear. Economic upheaval, bitter religious disagreements, and a political challenge to the crown that ended in civil war all contributed to decades of unrest, violence, and misery. These crises played an important role in reviving the dream of colonization. The strains of economic change were apparent everywhere in England. The rise of the woolens industry and the transformation of farmland into sheep pastures left thousands of tenant farm families homeless. Sheep eat men became the bitter cry of farmers who, overnight, had become vagabonds, roaming from countryside to cities in search of work. Many turned to crime or prostitution to survive. The nation's most fortunate citizens began to discuss the merits of America as a, quote, dumping ground for the poor and desperate among them. The poor and desperate began to consider a dangerous ocean voyage and the unknown terrors of the New World a better choice than life on the streets of London or Bristol. Religious tensions troubled the nation as well. Although the official Church of England that Henry VIII had created in 1531 was Protestant, there were those who felt it had kept too many Catholic rituals and customs, and they sought to purify the church even further. To the monarchs of the Stuart dynasty, this Puritan criticism smacked of treason as well as heresy, for the king was not only head of the nation, but also head of the Anglican Church. The mistrust between Puritan reformers and their kings grew during the reigns of James I and his son Charles I, for both men were rumored to be secretly practicing Catholicism. The political situation was equally tense. A power struggle between the Crown and Parliament, which was the legislative branch of the English government, erupted into open warfare in 1642. This civil war brought together many of the threads of religious and political discontent and conflict, pitting Puritans, merchants, and members of the rising middle class against the Stuart king. A Puritan army led by Oliver Cromwell overthrew the monarchy, and in 1649, Cromwell took the radical step of executing Charles I. This execution established the supremacy of Parliament. Cromwell headed the new Commonwealth government until his death in 1658, but he proved no more popular than the former king. In 1660, the Stuart family was invited to take the throne once again. For the next 25 years, during a period called the Restoration, Charles II ruled England. But when the crown passed to his brother James II, who openly practiced Catholicism, a second revolution began, this time with far less bloodshed because James wisely fled to the safety of France. His Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William then came to the English throne. This glorious revolution of 1688, when Mary and William ascended the throne, ended almost a century of political, ideological, and economic instability. But by that time, thousands of Englishmen and women had already journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean, and 12 colonies covered the mainland shores. Settling the Upper South. Considering the questions, what were the goals of the Virginia Company and of the Calvert family in creating their Chesapeake Bay area colonies? Did the colonies achieve these goals? And what events illustrate the racial, class, and religious tensions in the Chesapeake? Fears of financial ruin had prevented any individual Englishman from following in Sir Walter Raleigh's footsteps. But by the beginning of the 17th century, English entrepreneurs had developed a new method of financing high-risk ventures, the Joint Stock Company. Definitely know the Joint Stock Company, young historians. In 1603, King James I granted a charter to 2 such joint stock companies eager to establish colonies on mainland North America. One company quickly failed. The remaining Virginia Company managed to create the first successful English colony in North America, the Jamestown Colony. The 101 men and 4 boys sent by the Virginia Company in 1607 found themselves crammed aboard 3 small ships. Tempers grew short as the months at sea grew long, and trouble aboard one ship landed an adventurer named John Smith in the ship's brig for his role in attempting to organize a mutiny. The colonists had more to worry about than Mr. Smith's temper, however. The Spanish had proven eager to repel any European competitors from the vast territory stretching from Florida to Maine that the Pope had granted them in the 16th century. Remember that Treaty of Tordesillas? And although the Indians had been friendly on the Caribbean islands where the English ships had stopped for provisions, the colonists were far from certain of the reception they'd receive when they reached the mainland. The 3 ships entered Chesapeake Bay 5 months after they had set sail. The colonists settled on a small peninsula that jutted out from a river they named the James in honor of their king, calling their little foothold Jamestown. As they explored their surroundings, the swampland, a lot of malaria there, really prime land here, great job, Jamestown. As they explore and meet the local Indians, the Englishmen concluded that prospects looked so good for forging a peaceful and profitable relationship. Yet even the least insightful among them should have recognized the wide chasm that separated Englishmen from Indians. To the local tribes, the land on which the colonists had set up their tents and begun to build their fortifications was not Virginia, but Senecomaca, and it belonged to the confederation of some 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes dominated by the Powhatan chieftain Wahunsinucock, as described back in Chapter 1. If the English found the Indians exotic in their body and face paints, their relative nakedness, their religious ceremonies, and their weaponry, the Pamunkeys, Arahatics, and Metapones found the cumbersome dress and the noisy but less than effective weaponry of the new arrivals equally odd. Each viewed their own culture as superior and, for a brief period, seemed unwilling to tolerate the misguided beliefs and behaviors of the other. If the English men and boys had known what lay in store for them in the next decade, they might have sailed for home at once, for the settlers soon faced a seemingly endless series of survival challenges. The site of their encampment where they settled proved unhealthy, and one by one colonists fell ill, suffering from typhus, malaria, or dysentery. Few of them had the skills needed to survive in what was proven to be a hostile and alien environment. You know how many farmers they brought? Pretty much none. Many lacked the experience or the motivation needed to clear fields, plant crops, or build fortifications. These adventurers, as one Englishman bluntly put it, never knew what a day's labor meant. The disease, starvation, and exposure to the elements that threatened to destroy the colony were temporarily relieved when the former troublemaker John Smith took command. Smith was hardly a well-liked man. He was overconfident and self-centered, full of exaggerated tales of his own heroic deeds as a mercenary in exotic lands. But Smith did have some survival knowledge, and he knew how to discipline men. He established a no-work, no-food policy. He who does not work does not eat was the line that he used, and he negotiated with the Powhatans for corn and other supplies. When John Smith left in 1609, the discipline and order he had established quickly collapsed. The original colonists and those who joined them the following spring remembered that winter as the starving time. These desperate colonists burned their housing to keep them warm and ate dogs, cats, mice, snakes, and even shoe leather in their struggle to survive. Only 60 settlers were alive at winter's end. The Powhatans had little sympathy for the colonists. Even before Smith had departed, cooperation between the two groups had begun to disintegrate. Despite all their problems, the English exhibited a sense of superiority and entitlement that alienated Wahunsinucock and his confederacy. By 1609, tension and resentment had turned to bloodshed, and raids and counterattacks defined Anglo-Indian relationships for over a decade. Wahunsinucock made several efforts to establish peace, but English encroachments on Indian lands made any lasting truce impossible. Lyquahunsunicock, his successor Opachancanough, the chief of the Pamunkeys, recognized that dealing with the English colonists would require warfare, not words. If the settlers were learning hard lessons in survival, the Virginia Company was learning hard lessons too. The colony was hanging on by a thread, but the stockholders saw no profits, only their yearly expenses of passage for new colonists and supplies for old ones. Prospects for improvement seemed bleak. The investors could see nothing of economic value in the region that they called the Chesapeake. The investors, however, turned out to be wrong. Tobacco, a weed native to the Americas, proved to be the colony's salvation. Pipe smoking had been a steady habit in England since the mid-16th century, and Englishmen were a reliable market for this brown gold, not the other brown gold, the beaver fur that we've talked about. The local strain of tobacco in Virginia was too harsh for English tastes, but one of the colonists, an enterprising young planter named John Rolfe, managed to transplant a milder strain of West Indian tobacco to the colony. Rolfe made a second contribution to the colony soon afterward, easing the strained Anglo-Indian relations by marrying an Indian princess named Pocahontas, who John Smith insisted had once saved his life. By 1612, the Virginia colony settlers were engaged in a mad race to plant and harvest as many acres of tobacco as possible. But the Virginia Company was unable to take full advantage of this unexpected windfall, for it had changed its policies in an effort to ease its financial burdens. In the beginning, the company owned all the land, but also bore all the costs of colonization. By 1618, however, 11 years after Jamestown's founding, the company's new policy allowed individual colonists to own land if they paid for their voyage to the colony. This Headright system granted each male colonist a deed for 50 acres of land for himself and for every man, woman, or child whose voyage he financed. So if you pay for somebody else's ticket to the New World, you get another 50 acres. For each ticket that you pay for, you get 50 acres. In this way, the Virginia Company shifted the cost of populating and developing the colony to others. But the Headrights also ended the company's monopoly on the suddenly valuable farmland. I want to skip back real fast and read a deeper understanding of history, who's telling the story, and whose voice is silent. What if 500 years from now, a historian wanted to learn how people in the early 21st century viewed the world around them and what they thought and felt about it? Who would they find telling the story, and whose voice would not be heard? Happily for this future historian, he or she would have no trouble finding documents and artifacts from people of all ages, races, religions, ethnicities, genders, and social classes. There would be letters, emails, government documents, television shows, photographs, household furnishings, clothing, court records, tax returns, not to mention Facebook pages. But today's historians of 17th century North America are not as lucky. Many, if not most, Indians, enslaved Africans, women, and indentured servants of the era could not write or didn't have the leisure time to write down their thoughts. They didn't have their portraits drawn or leave any likenesses of themselves. Their homes, their furnishings, their clothes, and other material sources or artifacts rarely survived over the decades and the centuries. Their stories, therefore, often come to us indirectly from the records of more privileged people, such as the ministers, government officials, masters, husbands, judges, and other members of the colonial elite. The challenge facing modern historians is to uncover more sources that give ordinary people their voice. We use archaeology and anthropology to help us understand how non-elite men and women lived and worked. We use computer technology to analyze data such as birth, death, and marriage records that reveal the life cycle of ordinary colonists. The result is a collective picture of their lives, yet individual voices remain rare, and thus the story remains incomplete. Back to the text. Other important concessions to the colonists soon followed. The military-style discipline instituted by John Smith and continued by later leaders was abandoned. At the same time, a measure of self-government was allowed. In 1618, the company created an elected representative lawmaking body called the House of Burgesses. That's the first time they meet at least is 1619. That's often a year associated with it, which gave the landholders, tobacco planters of Virginia, some control over local political matters. In effect, a business enterprise had finally become a colonial society. Definitely know the House of Burgesses. The Virginia Company did retain one of the colony's earliest traditions, a bad relationship with the Powhatan Indians. By 1622, with the population growing and tobacco bringing a measure of prosperity, Virginia planters pressed farther inland, seizing Indian land along local rivers. The new Powhatan chief, Opachancanough, decided to strike back. On what the Christian settlers called Good Friday, he mounted a deadly attack on Jamestown, killing a quarter of the colonists in a single day. The company responded as quickly as it could, sending weapons to the Virginians. For 2 years, war raged between the Indians and the English. Although the bloodshed had become less frequent by 1625, a final peace was not reached for a decade. By that time, disease and violence had taken its toll on the Powhatans. Once over 40,000 strong, they had dwindled to fewer than 500 people, from 40,000 to fewer than 500. The Good Friday Massacre, as the English called it, brought important changes for the colony. King James I had already begun an investigation of the Virginia Company's management record and the colony's growing profit potential. When he learned of the renewed conflict between Indians and the colonists, the king took away the company's charter and declared Virginia to be a royal possession, so the crown takes over. If the king's advisors had tallied the cost in human life for planting this first English colony in the same manner that the company tallied expenses in pence and pounds, they would have found the outcome sobering. By 1624, only 1,275 of the original 8,500 settlers who had arrived since 1607 remained alive. Fortunately, no other English colony would pay such a price for its creation. Maryland, a Catholic refuge. Soon, plans for a second southern colony were brewing in England. The man behind this project was not a merchant or an entrepreneur, and profit was not his motive. George Calvert, a wealthy Catholic whom King Charles I had just made Lord Baltimore, envisioned a religious refuge in America for fellow Catholics suffering growing harassment and discrimination at home. Calvert acquired a charter from the king for a generous tract of land east and north of Chesapeake Bay. Here he planned to establish a highly traditional society dominated by powerful noblemen and populated by obedient tenant farmers. Thus, in the 1630s, George Calvert was a reactionary thinker with a radical vision. Calvert died before a single colonist could be recruited for his Maryland. His son, Cecilius Calvert, took on the task of establishing the colony. To Calvert's surprise, few English Catholics showed any enthusiasm for the project. When the first boatload of colonists sailed up the Chesapeake Bay in 1634, most of the 200 volunteers were actually young Protestants seeking a better life. Calvert soon adopted the Headright system developed by the Virginia Company to attract additional settlers and to bring more people over. The lure of land ownership, he realized, was the key to populating Maryland. Marylanders immediately turned to planting the profitable staple crop tobacco and joined the scramble for a good riverfront land. Like the Virginians, these colonists used trickery, threats, and violence to pry acres of potential farmland from resisting Indians. By mid-century, the two Chesapeake colonies could claim a modest prosperity, even though their populations grew slowly. But they could not claim a peaceful existence. The political crises that shook England during the mid-17th century sent shockwaves across the Atlantic Ocean to American shores. These crises intertwined with local tensions among colonists or between colonists and Indians to produce rebellions, raids, and civil wars. Troubles on the Chesapeake. In Maryland, tensions ran high between the Catholic minority who had political influence beyond their numbers because of Lord Baltimore's support and the Protestant majority in the colony. But with Oliver Cromwell's rise to power in England, Calvert realized that his power to protect Maryland's Catholics was in jeopardy. Hoping to avoid persecution of the Catholic colonists, Calvert offered religious toleration to all Marylanders. In 1649, he issued the innovative Toleration Act. Definitely know this. The Toleration Act of Maryland, here 1649, protected all Christians from being troubled or molested in respect of his or her religion. Cromwell, however, promptly repealed the act. In 1654, Parliament took Maryland away from the Calvert family and established a Protestant assembly in the colony. As Calvert had feared, a wave of anti-Catholic persecution followed. Despite his best efforts, religious freedom is not going to be the rule of the land, or the law of the land, Within a year, a bloody civil war was raging in Maryland. Protestant forces won the fiercely fought Battle of the Severn, but their victory proved futile when Oliver Cromwell died and the monarchy was restored. Charles II returned Maryland to the Calvert family, who had always been loyal supporters of the Stuart dynasty. Despite this reversal of fortune, Protestants in Maryland continued their struggle, organizing unsuccessful rebellions in 1659, 1676, and 1681. Then finally, in 1689, the Glorious Revolution prompted Maryland's Protestants to rally once again. Led by an unlikely-looking hero, the stooped and nearly crippled minister John Coode, these colonists formed an army they called the Protestant Association. By 1691, Coode had persuaded the crown to make Maryland a royal colony. The story did not end there, however. In 1715, the fourth Lord Baltimore gave up the Catholic faith and joined the Church of England. Maryland was once again returned to the Calverts. Virginia was less affected by religious controversy than its neighbor. Their colonists were primarily Anglicans, although small communities of Quakers, Puritans, and even members of the radical Dutch Labadist sect were scattered throughout. Religious differences, however, did not spark hostilities. Instead, the fault lines in Virginia society developed between the wealthy planters of the Tidewater region and the ambitious newcomers seeking to make their fortunes in the backcountry. It was this tension that led to Bacon's Rebellion. Many of the problems behind this failed rebellion would resurface 100 years later during the events leading up to the American Revolutionary War. Colonial Chesapeake life. Every aspect of life in the Chesapeake colonies, observers noted, seemed to be shaped by tobacco. Its cultivation set rhythms of work and play. Planting, tending, harvesting, and drying tobacco leaves took almost 10 months out of the year, beginning in late winter and ending just before Christmas. In the short period between the holiday and the start of the new planting cycle, Chesapeake planters, their families, and their servants worked frantically to catch up on the other neglected farm chores. They would do repairs, sew and mend, build new cabins and sheds, cut timber and firewood. They also compressed what meager social life they had into these winter weeks, engaging whenever possible in hasty courtships followed by marriage. Because tobacco quickly exhausted the soil in which it grew, planters moved frequently to new acres on their estates or to newly acquired lands farther west. Since they rarely stayed in one place very long, planters placed little value on permanent homes or social institutions such as schools. Throughout the century, Chesapeake colonists sacrificed many of the familiar forms of community life to the demands of their profitable crop. Planters needed a labor force large enough and cheap enough to ensure their profits. As long as poverty and social unrest plagued England, they found the workers they needed in their homeland. Over 175,000 young, single, and impoverished immigrants flooded the Chesapeake during the 17th century, their passages paid by the ship captain or by the planter. In exchange for the transatlantic voyages, these indentured servants worked for several years in the tobacco fields without pay. Planters preferred a male workforce because they shared the general European assumption that farming was a masculine activity. As a result, men outnumbered women in most areas of Virginia and Maryland by 3 to 1. In some areas, the ratio was a remarkable 6 to 1 until the end of the century. For indentured servants, and often for their masters as well, life was short and brutal. They spent long, back-breaking days in the fields. Their food rations were meager, their clothing and bedding inadequate, and their shoulders frequently scarred by the master's whip. Servants wrote letters home describing their miserable existence. "People cry out day and night," wrote one young man, who told his father that most servants would give up any limb to be in England again. Most servants also expressed doubts that they would survive to win their freedom, and in many cases they were correct. Disease and malnutrition took the lives of perhaps a quarter of these bound laborers. Free colonists fared little better than servants. Typhus, dysentery, and malaria killed thousands. Over 1/4 of the infants born in the Chesapeake did not live to see their first birthdays, and another quarter of the population died before reaching the age of 20. One result of this demographic disaster was short-lived marriages, followed by the prompt remarriage of the surviving partner. Complex families emerged, and after several marriages and remarriages, children could be found in many households who were not related by blood to either of the adult parents in the family. The last decades of the century saw a change in the labor force. The steady supply of English workers dried up as economic conditions in England improved. At the same time, the cost of purchasing an African slave declined. During the next century, the shift from English servants to African slaves would be completed. Laws were already in place to accommodate this transition to a permanently enslaved labor force. As early as 1662, Virginia had passed a law entitled, quote, "Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother," making it impossible for a black child to claim freedom based on his father's race. By 1691, laws forbidding marriage between the races had become common in the southern colonies. In these ways, white colonists made race the defining characteristic of permanent servitude. New England, colonies of dissenters. Considering the two questions, what types of society did the Puritans create in Massachusetts, and what troubles confronted New England colonists, and how did they respond? While Captain John Smith was barking orders at the settlers in Jamestown, some religious dissenters in a small English village were preparing to escape King James's wrath. These residents of Scrooby Village were people of modest means without powerful political allies or a popular cause, but they had gone one step further than the majority of Puritans who continued to be members of the Anglican Church despite their criticisms of it. The Scrooby villagers had left the church altogether, forming a separate sect of their own. James I despised these separatists and declared his intention to drive them out of England or worse. In 1611, the Scrooby separatists fled to the Netherlands city of Leyden. They saw themselves as pilgrims on a spiritual journey to religious freedom. The Dutch welcomed them warmly, but several pilgrims feared that the comfortable life they had found in Holland was diminishing their devotion to God. By 1620, William Bradford was leading a small group of these transplanted English men and women on a second pilgrimage to America. The Plymouth Colony. These pilgrims set sail on an old creaky ship called the Mayflower. On board, too, were a band of strangers, outsiders to the religious sect who simply wanted passage to America. Crammed together in close and uncomfortable quarters, pilgrims and strangers weathered a nightmare voyage of violent storms and choppy waters. After 9 weeks at sea, the captain anchored the Mayflower at Cape Cod, almost 1,000 miles north of the original Virginia destination. The exhausted passengers did not complain, they fell to the ground to give thanks. Once the thrill of standing on dry land had passed, however, many of them sank into depression. Early winter New England was dreary, alien, and disturbingly empty. William Bradford's own wife, Dorothy, may have committed suicide in the face of this bleak landscape. Talk of setting sail for Virginia spread through the ranks of the ship's crew and the passengers, and mutiny was in the air. To calm the situation, Bradford negotiated an unusual contract with every man aboard the ship: pilgrim, crew, servant, and stranger. This document, known as the Mayflower Compact, granted political rights to any man willing to remain and to abide by whatever laws the new colony enacted. Here was an unheard of opportunity for poor men to participate in governing themselves. All agreed, and the new colony of Plymouth plantations began to prepare for the long winter ahead. Here, as in Virginia, the first winter brought sickness, hunger, and death. Half of the colonists didn't survive. When a Patuxet Indian named Squanto came upon the remaining men and women in the spring of 1621, he found them huddled in flimsy shelters, trapped between a menacing forest and a dangerous ocean. Squanto sympathized with their confusion and their longings for home because he had crossed the Atlantic in 1605 aboard an English trading ship and spent several years in an alien environment. He also understood what it meant to be a survivor, for the Pilgrims had settled where his own village had once stood. His entire family and tribe had been wiped out by diseases carried by English traders and fishermen. Squanto helped the colonists, teaching them how to plant corn, squash, and pumpkins. Perhaps his greatest service, however, was in helping William Bradford negotiate a peace treaty with Massasoit, leader of the local Wampanoag Indians. The combined efforts of Squanto and Massasoit saved the Plymouth colony, and in the fall of 1621, English settlers and Indian guests sat down together in a traditional harvest celebration of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving would not become the holiday that we know it as now for another few centuries. Plymouth grew slowly, its colonists earning their livings by farming, fishing, and lumbering. A few Pilgrims grew wealthy by developing a fur trade with the Indians. Unlike the Jamestown settlers, the Plymouth community purchased land rather than seizing it, and they were strong allies when warfare broke out between Massasoit's people and their enemies. In fact, the colonists proved to be such ferocious fighters that they were known as Wateroganaarji, or cutthroats. Massachusetts Bay and its settlers. A second colony seat appeared beside Plymouth plantations. In 1629, a group of prosperous Puritans, led by the 41-year-old lawyer and landowner John Winthrop, secured a charter for their Massachusetts Bay Company from King Charles I. Government harassment, coupled with the deepening economic depression in England, spurred these Puritans to set sail for what would be called New England. As religious tensions and economic distress increased in England, Massachusetts attracted thousands more settlers. This great migration continued until Oliver Cromwell's Puritan army took control of England. While profit motivated the Virginia colonists and a desire to worship in peace prompted the Pilgrims to sail to America, the Puritans of Massachusetts were people on a mission. They hoped to create a model Christian community, a, quote, city upon a hill, that's from a Winthrop sermon, that would persuade all English men and women that the reforms they proposed to the Anglican Church were correct. John Winthrop set out their mission in a speech to the passengers aboard the Arabella. "The eyes of all peoples are upon us," Winthrop warned, and more importantly, God too was watching them. If they abandoned or forgot their mission, the consequences would surely include divine punishment. This sense of mission influenced the physical as well as spiritual shape of the colony. Massachusetts colonists created tight-knit farming villages and small seaport towns in which citizens could monitor one another's behavior as well as come together in prayer. This settlement pattern fit well with the realities of New England's climate and terrain, since the short growing season and the rocky soil made large, isolated plantations based on staple crops impossible. The colonists, homesick for English villages in regions such as East Anglia, did their best to reproduce familiar architecture and placement of public buildings. The result was often a hub-and-spoke design, with houses tightly clustered around a village green or common pasture, a church beside the green, and most of the fields and farms within walking distance of the village center. This design set natural limits on the size of any village because beyond a certain point, usually measured in a winter's walk to church, a farm family was considered outside the community circle. As the town's population grew and the available farmland was further from the village green, settlers on the outer rim of the town usually chose to create a new community, a process the Puritans called hiving off. Unlike the Chesapeake colonists, many New England settlers came as members of a family. Thus, the gender ratio in the northern colonies was never dramatically skewed. And unlike their Chesapeake counterparts, New Englanders never endured a demographic disaster. The cool temperatures and clean drinking water made the region a healthy place for Europeans, healthier than England itself. Infant mortality was low, and most children lived to marry and produce families of their own. A couple could expect to live a long life together and raise a family of 5 to 7 children. One outcome of this longevity was a rare phenomenon in the 17th century English world: grandparents. So far, things up in the north are a lot healthier. The gender ratio is a lot more balanced. That means that men and women are going to be, just about equal. They basically settled in a much better environment, and they're going to benefit from that. Both Puritans and neighboring Pilgrims spoke of the family as a little commonwealth, the building block on which the larger society was constructed. And like the larger society, the family was a hierarchy. Children were to obey parents, wives were to obey husbands. A husband, however, was expected to care for and be respectful toward his wife. Marriage involved many practical duties as well. Wives were expected to strive to be notable housewives, industrious, economical managers of resources, and skilled at several crafts. They were to spin yarn, sew, cook, bake, pickle, butcher farm animals, cure meat, churn butter, and set cheeses. Husbands were expected to labor in the fields or in the shop to provide income for their families. Although obligated to be tender and loving, the husband controlled the resources of the family. This was true in all English colonies, although in the Chesapeake, a husband's early death often left the wife in charge of the family farm or shop and its profits until sons came of age. Under English law, a married woman as a femme covert lost many of her legal rights. Married women could gain basic legal rights only through special contracts made with their husbands. Puritan communities, however, frowned on any such arrangements. A husband also represented the family's interests in the realm of politics. No matter how wise or wealthy a woman might become, she did not have a political voice. That was her husband's job. Toward a more perfect union, the case of the vanishing women. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave women the right to vote. Until then, in most states, women had no political citizenship. For much of our history, women also had very little legal identity. Coverture, a doctrine developed in England during the Middle Ages, severely limited a woman's legal identity once she married because in law she came under the protection and governance of her husband. She could not own property, sign legal documents, sue or be sued, enter into a contract, or keep the wages she earned. In many cases, she was not held responsible for breaking the law since it was assumed that she was acting under the orders of her husband. English colonists brought this concept of coverture with them when they immigrated to North America, and until the mid-19th century, when Married Women's Property Acts began to be passed in some states, these coverture restrictions continued. They reinforced the notion that women could not and should not be full political citizens. The decline of coverture was one factor in making it possible to amend the Constitution to give suffrage to women. And the fight for women's rights is long-standing. It's not until the 1970s that married women can get credit cards in their own name in every state. Government in Puritan Massachusetts. To create the city upon a hill, the directors of the Massachusetts Bay Company needed and expected the full cooperation of all colonists. However, John Winthrop made it clear that this wilderness Zion was not intended to be an egalitarian society. Egalitarian, by the way, means believing in human equality. This is not a place where everybody is equal. Like most of his audience, Winthrop believed that it was natural and correct for some people to be rich and some people to be poor. Other colonies denied a political voice to women, children, servants, young men, and adult men without property, but Massachusetts further limited political participation. No man in Massachusetts had a full political voice unless he was an acknowledged church member, not just a churchgoer. Church membership, or sainthood, was granted only after a person testified to an experience of saving grace, a moment of intense awareness of God's power, and a reassuring conviction of personal salvation. Thus, Massachusetts made religious qualifications as important as one's sex or economic status in the colony's political life. Massachusetts differed from the Chesapeake colonies in other significant ways. The colony's government enforced biblical law as well as English civil and criminal law. This meant that the government regulated a colonist's religious beliefs and practices and personal behavior. For example, every colonist was required to attend church and to observe the Sabbath as Puritan custom dictated. The church played a role in supervising business dealings, parent-child relationships, and marital life. In the early decades of the colony, the Puritan sense of mission left little room for religious toleration. Colonial leaders saw no reason to welcome anybody who disagreed with their religious views. English America was large, they argued, and people of other faiths could settle elsewhere. Winthrop's government was particularly aggressive against members of a new sect called the Quakers, who came to Massachusetts on a mission of their own to convert Puritans to their faith. Quakers entering the colony were beaten, imprisoned, or branded with hot irons and then thrown out. If they returned, they were hanged. Puritan leaders showed just as little tolerance toward members of their own communities who criticized or challenged the rules of the Bay Colony or the beliefs of its church. They drove out men and women they perceived to be heretics or religious traitors. Almost anyone could be labeled a heretic, even a popular Puritan minister like Roger Williams. Roger Williams attracted a devoted following with his electrifying sermons and his impressive knowledge of Scripture, but he soon attracted the attention of local authorities as well, for his sermons were highly critical of the colonial government. From his pulpit, Williams condemned political leaders for seizing Indian land, calling their tactics of intimidation and violence a national sin. He also denounced laws requiring church attendance. In 1635, John Winthrop's government banished Roger Williams from the colony. With snow thick on the ground, Williams left Salem and sought refuge with the Narragansett Indians. When spring came, many of the Salem congregation joined him in exile. His followers love him so much they follow him out of the colony. Together in 1635, they created a community called Providence that welcomed dissenters of all kinds, including Quakers, Jews, and Baptists. Providence also attracted other Massachusetts colonists who were tired of the tight controls imposed on their lives by Winthrop and his colleagues. In 1644, the English government granted Williams a charter for his colony, which he eventually called Rhode Island. Within their borders, Rhode Islanders firmly established what was then a radical idea: separation of church and state. Soon after the Massachusetts authorities rid the colony of Roger Williams, a new challenge arose. In 1634, a merchant named William Hutchison arrived in Massachusetts with his family. His wife, Anne Hutchison, had received an exceptionally fine education from her father and was eloquent, witty, and well-versed in scripture. In addition, she was clearly knowledgeable about the religious debates of the day. Like Williams, Hutchison put little stock in the power of a minister or in any rules of behavior to assist an individual in the search for salvation. Hutchison's opinions, aired in popular meetings at her home, disturbed the Puritan authorities. That she was a woman made her outspoken defiance even more shocking. Men like John Winthrop believed that women ought to be silent in the church and had no business criticizing male authorities. However, male merchants and craftsmen who lacked political rights because they were not members of the saintly elect welcomed her attacks on the authorities. Hutchison also attracted Puritan saints who resented the tight grip of the colonial government on their lives. In the end, none of Hutchison's supporters could protect her against the determined opposition of the Puritan leadership. In 1637, she was arrested and brought to trial. John Winthrop and his colleagues declared her a heretic, unfit to our society, and banished her from Massachusetts. Many Puritans who left Massachusetts did so by choice, not because they were banished. As a really quick note here, Hutchison ends up going to Rhode Island, but she finds that tolerant atmosphere just a little bit too tolerant, a little bit too open to her liking, so she takes her family to New York City, where they end up dying in an attack from Native Americans, I believe. Many Puritans who left Massachusetts did so by choice, not because they were banished. For example, in 1636, the Reverend Thomas Hooker and his entire Newton congregation resettled in the Connecticut River Valley. Other Puritan congregations followed. In 1644, the Connecticut Valley towns of Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor united with the Saybrook settlement at the mouth of the Connecticut River to create the colony of Connecticut. In 1660, the independent New Haven community joined them. Other Bay colonists searching for new or better lands made their way north to what later became Maine and New Hampshire. New Hampshire settlers wanted charter for their own colony in 1679, but Maine remained part of Massachusetts until it became a state in 1820. Indian suppression. Although the Puritan colonists hoped to create a godly community, they were often motivated by greed and jealousy. Between 1636 and the 1670s, New Englanders came into conflict with one another over desirable land. They also waged particularly violent warfare against the Indians of the region. When the Connecticut Valley towns sprang up, for example, Winthrop tried to assert Bay Colony authority over them. His motives were personal. He and his friends had expected to develop the Valley area lands themselves someday. The Connecticut settlers ignored Winthrop's claims and blocked his attempts to prevent their independence from Massachusetts. But they could not ignore the Indians of the area, who understood very clearly the threat that all English settlers posed to their territories and their way of life. Sassacus, leader of the Pequots, hoped that an armed struggle would break out between Winthrop and the new Connecticut towns, destroying them both. Instead, however, the two English rivals joined forces to eliminate the Pequots. In 1636, the Pequot War had begun, with the Indians under attack from both Massachusetts and Connecticut armies, helped by their Indian allies, the Narragansetts and the Mohicans. Atrocities followed. Captain John Mason attacked the defenseless Pequot town of Mystic Village, where only civilians were present. Captain John Underhill of the Massachusetts Army recorded the slaughter with obvious satisfaction. Many Pequots were burned in the fort, both men, women, and children. When the survivors tried to surrender to the Narragansetts, Puritan soldiers killed them. The brutal war did not end until all the Pequot men had been killed and the women and children sold into slavery. If the Narragansett Indians believed their alliance with Winthrop would protect them, they were mistaken. Within 5 years, the Puritans had assassinated the Narragansett chief, an act of insurance against problems with these former Indian allies. Remember the Narragansetts, they had been allies with Roger Williams, with Rhode Island. Initially, Williams deals really fairly with the Native Americans, and he, tries to compensate them fairly for lands and for things that they get. Initially, they're pretty friendly, but that is not going to last. By 1675, Pilgrims, too, were at war with local Indians. Their demands for more land led the Wampanoag chief Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, to resist. Metacomet's early devastating raids on white settlements terrified the colonists, but soon the casualties and atrocities grew on both sides in what the English called King Philip's War. With the help of Iroquois troops sent in by the governor of New York, the colonists finally defeated the Wampanoags. The victors murdered Metacomet and impaled his head on a stick. Indian objections to colonial expansion in New England had been silenced. Indeed, few native peoples remained to offer resistance of any sort. Several tribes had been wiped out entirely in the war, or their few survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Those who escaped enslavement or death scattered to the north and the west. The victory had cost the English dearly also. More than 2,000 New England colonists lost their lives as the war spread from Plymouth to nearby settlements, and the war left a legacy of hate that prompted Indian tribes west of Massachusetts to block Puritan expansion whenever possible. The costs of New England's Indian policy prompted colonial leaders in other regions to try less aggressive tactics in dealing with local Indians. For the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, and the Pequots, however, this decision came too late. Change and reaction in England and New England. The rise of England's Puritan Commonwealth during the 1640s was celebrated in New England, but many Puritans returned to England to enjoy Cromwell's success. A lot of the newcomers to the colony during the rest of the century were not Puritans at all, but men and women eager to improve their fortunes. Among those Puritans who remained, religious zeal seemed to fade. Few native-born colonists petitioned for full membership or sainthood in their local churches as their parents had done, perhaps because of their growing involvement with commerce or because their missions seemed to have been fulfilled by Cromwell and his followers back home in England. By 1662, anxious members of the older generation of saints approved a compromise to ensure that their sons would enjoy political rights despite their failure to recount a conversion experience, which is what was required for sainthood. The resulting halfway covenant kept political power in the hands of Puritans for the moment. The halfway covenant, it was an agreement that gave partial membership in Puritan churches to the children of church members, even if they had not had that saving grace experience. Pressures from England could not be dealt with so easily, however. After the Restoration in 1660, Charles II cast a doubtful eye on a colony that sometimes ignored English civil law if it conflicted with biblical demands. In 1683, Charles insisted that the Bay Colony revise its charter to weaken the influence of biblical teachings and eliminate the stringent voting requirements, but the Massachusetts government said no. With that, Charles revoked the charter. Massachusetts remained in political limbo until 1685, when James II came to the throne. Then conditions grew far worse. Talk about out of the frying pan and into the fire here, folks. In an effort to centralize administration of his growing American empire, King James decided on a massive reorganization of the mainland colonial world. He combined several of the northern colonies into one large unit under direct royal control. This mega colony, the Dominion of New England, included Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Plymouth Plantations, New Jersey, and New York, both newly acquired from the Dutch. That used to be New Amsterdam, New York did. James expected the Dominion to increase the patronage or political favors he could provide to his loyal supporters, favors such as generous land grants or colonial administrative appointments. He also expected to increase revenues by imposing duties and taxes on colonial goods in the vast region that he now controlled. How do you think all of these colonies who have their charters dissolved and now they're all placed under direct royal control, this Dominion of New England, what do you think they're going to think about that? Are they going to be happy about this? What King James did not expect was how strongly colonists resented his dominion and the man he chose to govern it, the arrogant and greedy Sir Edmund Andros. Andros immediately offended New England Puritans by establishing the Church of England as the official religion of this brand new mega colony. Andros also alienated many non-Puritans in Massachusetts by abolishing the representative assembly there. Non-Puritan men had been struggling to be included in the assembly, not to have the assembly destroyed. Andros's high-handed tactics united Massachusetts colonists who had been at odds with each other. When the Dominion governor imposed new taxes, saints and non-saints alike refused to pay them. There's unity between the colonies who resent the Dominion of New England, similar to how we see unity among the 13 colonies on the eve of American independence. Upon receiving news of the Glorious Revolution, Boston citizens imprisoned Edmund Andros and shipped him back to England to stand trial as a traitor to the nation's new Protestant government. Massachusetts Puritans hoped to be rewarded for their patriotism, but although William and Mary had abolished the Dominion, remember the Glorious Revolution is when William and Mary came to the throne, they chose not to restore the Bay Colony Charter. In 1691, Massachusetts became a royal colony, its governor appointed by the Crown. Suffrage, or voting rights, was granted to all free males who met an English property requirement. Church membership would never again be a criterion for citizenship in the colony. For many colonists, the takeover of Massachusetts by the king was a tragedy. But by 1692, a tragedy of a very different sort struck the colony. In that year, a group of young women and girls in Salem Village began to act rather strangely. They fell into violent fits, contorting their bodies and crying out in pain. Local authorities might have pronounced them possessed by the devil or a demon, but instead they declared them to be victims of bewitchment. This meant that somebody in the colony was practicing witchcraft, but who and how many? Under questioning, the young women pointed their fingers at several local women, including a West Indian slave named Tituba, as their tormentors. The conviction that the devil had come to Massachusetts spread quickly, and the number of people accused of witchcraft mushroomed. Within months, more than 100 women, men, and children were crowded into local jails awaiting trial. Accusations, trials, and even executions, 19 in all, continued until the new royal governor, Sir William Phips, arrived in the colony and forbade any further arrests. Phips dismissed the court that had passed judgment based on spectral evidence, that is, testimony by the alleged victims that they had seen the spirits of those tormenting them. In January of 1693, Phips assembled a new court that acquitted the remaining prisoners. What had prompted this terrible episode in colonial history? In the 17th century, it was widely believed in both Europe and America that the devil and his disciples could work great harm in a community. Isolated instances of witchcraft or possession had cropped up in the Chesapeake as well, but the spectacle of the Salem witch trials seemed to have been prompted by more than just the affliction of young women or confessions of witchcraft. The transition to a royal colony had prompted anxieties, and the growing commercial orientation of many colonists seemed a dangerous challenge to the religious mission traditional Puritan colonists still supported. A flood of immigrants from the frontier, driven into the coastal towns by Indian raids, also raised the specter for some colonists that the devil was operating through the Indian population as well. And there were some tensions too between the newcomers and the oldcomers, and we see those tensions present also in who gets accused of being witch and who's doing the accusing. John Winthrop's warning over half a century before that God would punish the colonists if they abandoned their faith may not have been totally forgotten. Belief in witchcraft didn't end in 1792, but after the Salem tragedy, no colony ever mounted a witch hunt again. And that should say after 1692, because the Salem tragedy did not happen in 1792. The pluralism of the Middle Colonies. How did New Netherland develop under English control, and what cultural and economic tensions came to a head during Leisler's rebellion, and what made William Penn's vision for Pennsylvania so distinctive? Between the Chesapeake and New England lay the vast stretch of forest and farmland called New Netherland, a Dutch colony that was home to settlers from Holland, Sweden, Germany, and France. In the 1660s, Charles II seized the area and drove the Dutch from the Atlantic coast of North America. The English divided the conquered territory into 3 colonies. We get New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Although the region changed hands, it did not change its character. The Middle Colonies, as they're known, remained a multicultural, commercially oriented, and competitive society no matter whose flag flew over them. From New Netherland to New York. By 1652, England and Holland had become bitter rivals, fighting 3 naval wars to decide who would control the transatlantic trade in raw materials and manufactured goods. After each war, the Dutch lost ground, and their decline made it likely that their New Netherland settlement would be abandoned. Remember that New Amsterdam is a part of this too, that's a city in it. King Charles II of England wanted New Netherland very much, and James, Duke of York, later King James II, was eager to satisfy his brother's desires. In 1664, Charles had agreed to give James control of the region lying between the Connecticut and Delaware rivers, if James could get it away from the Dutch. When the Duke's 4 armed ships arrived in New Amsterdam Harbor and aimed their cannons at the town, Governor Peter Stuyvesant tried to rally the local residents to resist, but they refused. Life under the English, they reasoned, would probably be no worse than life under the Dutch. Perhaps it might be better. The humiliated governor surrendered to the colony, and in 1664, New Netherland became New York without a shot being fired. In many ways, James proved to be a very liberal ruler, allowing the Dutch and other European colonists to keep their lands, practice their religions, and conduct their business in their native languages. But the Duke's generosity and tolerance did not extend to taxation matters. James taxed New Yorkers heavily and allowed no representative assembly that might interfere with his use of the treasury. All political offices in the new colony, high or low, went to the Duke's friends, creating a patronage system that impressed even King Charles. James's colony did not develop as he had hoped, however. Settlement did not expand to the north and east as he wished. He could not enlist the aid of influential New Yorkers in his expansion plans, even though he finally offered them the incentive of a representative assembly in 1682. By 1685, James, now King of England, had lost interest in the colony, abandoning his schemes for its growth and abolishing the representative assembly as well. Leisler's Rebellion. Although James viewed New York as a failure, the colony actually grew rapidly during his rule. The population doubled between 1665 and 1685, reaching 15,000 the year the Duke ascended to the English throne. These new settlers added to the cultural diversity that had always characterized the region. The Middle Colonies are very diverse, know that. For the colony became a religious refuge to French Protestants, English Quakers, and Scottish Presbyterians. New York's diverse community, however, did not always live in harmony. English, Dutch, and German merchants competed fiercely for control of New York City's trade and for dominance in the city's cultural life. An equally intense rivalry existed between Manhattan's merchants and Albany's fur traders. Only one thing united these competitors: a burning resentment of James's political control and the men he chose to enforce his will. Their anger increased when James created the Dominion of New England. Kind of like how hatred of the Dominion drew different colonies together, hatred of the Dominion is also going to draw together individuals here within New York City who come from many different backgrounds and maybe don't agree on much else other than they really don't like James and the Dominion. In 1689, news of the Glorious Revolution prompted a revolt in New York City similar to the one that shook Boston. Jacob Leisler, a German merchant, emerged as its leader. Although Leisler lacked the charisma and commanding presence that had allowed Nathaniel Bacon to rise to power in 1676, he was able to take control of the entire colony. When England's new rulers, William and Mary, sent their governor to New York, Leisler refused to surrender the reins of government. This time, the abrasive, headstrong merchant found few supporters, and eventually he was forced to step down. To Leisler's surprise, he was then arrested and charged with treason. Both he and his son-in-law were tried, found guilty, and executed. As befit traitors in the 17th century, the two rebels were hanged, disemboweled while still alive, that means that their intestines are cut out, and then they're beheaded. Afterward, their mutilated bodies were quartered, which is when they cut you into 4 parts. In death, Leisler became a hero and a martyr. Popular anger was so great that to quiet the discontent, the new governor had to permit the formation of a representative assembly. Several of the men elected to this new legislature were ardent Leislerians, and for many years, New York politics remained a battleground between them and supporters of the royal governor and the king. William Penn's Holy Experiment. More than most dissenting sects, Quakers had paid a high price for their strongly held convictions. They had been jailed in England and Scotland, and they'd been harassed by their neighbors throughout the empire. Quaker leaders thus had strong motives to create a refuge for members of their beleaguered sect. In the 1670s, a group of wealthy Quakers purchased New Jersey from its original proprietors and offered religious freedom and generous political rights even to the Puritans residing there. The best known of these proprietors was William Penn, who'd given up a life of privilege, luxury, and self-indulgence in Restoration society, and he'd embraced the morally demanding life of the Quakers. Their religious inclusion so that they can be safe kind of reminds me of what happened in Maryland with the toleration of Catholics. Both Penn and his father were loyal supporters of King Charles. The king rewarded this devotion in 1681 when he granted the younger Penn a charter to a huge area west of the Delaware River. This gave Penn the opportunity to create a refuge for Quakers based on their religious principles. Penn called his new colony Pennsylvania creative, meaning Penn's Woods, in memory of his father. The southernmost section of Penn's grant, added later by Charles II, developed independently of Penn's control, and in 1776 that became the state of Delaware. Like most colonial proprietors, Penn expected to profit from his charter, and he set a quit rent, or a small fee, on all land that was purchased within his colony. But Quaker values and principles were the basis for his holy experiment. At the heart of the Quaker faith, this is important, is the conviction that the divine spirit, or inner light, resided in every human being. Quakers thus were expected to respect all individuals. By their plain dress and their refusal to remove their hats in the presence of their social betters, Quakers demonstrated their belief that all men and women were equal. At the strikingly simple Quaker meetings or worship service, any member who felt moved to speak was welcome to participate, no matter how poor or uneducated, and no matter what age or sex. Although they actively sought converts, Quakers were always tolerant of other religions. They are also very peaceful. They are nonviolent. They don't see a purpose for violence and go into war in their personal lives. Initially, as they start off too, they will practice slaveholding, but they are also quickly one of the first communities to say that you cannot remain a member and also be a slaveholder. Early on, they're committed to the cause of abolition before a lot of other big groups are. Pennsylvania's political structure reflected this egalitarianism. All free male residents had the right to vote during Penn's lifetime, and the legislature they elected had full governing powers. The political quarrels that developed in Pennsylvania's assembly actually shocked Penn, but his only action was to urge political leaders not to be so noisy and open in your dissatisfactions. Penn's land policy also reflected Quaker principles. Unlike many proprietors, he wanted no politically powerful landlords or economically dependent tenant farmers. He does not want a big stratified society, hierarchical society. Instead, he actively promoted a society of independent landowning farm families. Penn also insisted that all land be purchased fairly from the Indians, and he pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence between the two cultures. William Penn took an active role in making Pennsylvania a multicultural society, recruiting non-English settlers through pamphlets that stressed the religious and political freedoms and economic opportunities his colony offered. More than 8,000 immigrants poured into the colony in the first 4 years. Many did come from England, but Irish, Scottish, Welsh, French, Scandinavian, and German settlers came as well. To their English neighbors who did not speak German, newcomers from Germany such as the Mennonites and Amish were known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. Deutsch, meaning German, would have been correct. When William Penn died in 1717, he left behind a successful, dynamic colony. Philadelphia was already emerging as a great shipping and commercial center, rivaling the older seaports of Boston and New York City. But the commercial orientation here, as in Puritan Massachusetts, attracted colonists who were more secular in their interests and objectives than the colony's Quaker founder. Many newcomers saw Penn's Indian policy as a check on their ambitions and preferred to seize land from the Indians rather than purchase it. The demand for military protection by these land-hungry farmers in the western part of the colony, similar to the demands made decades before by Nathaniel Bacon and his followers, became a major political issue and a matter of conscience for Quakers, whose religious principles included pacifism. Pacifism, by the way, is that commitment to peace, its opposition to war or violence of any kind. Eventually, many Quakers chose to resign from the colonial government rather than struggle to uphold a holy experiment that their neighbors did not support. We're going to come back to that idea of pacifism, Quakers in Pennsylvania, when we get to the Paxton Boys' Revolt. Colonies of the Lower South. Considering the questions, what type of society did the founders of Carolina hope to create? How did the colony differ from their expectations? Because initially there's not North and South Carolina, it's just one Carolina. And why did philanthropists create Georgia? Why did the king support this project? No new colonies were created on the mainland during the Puritan Revolution or the Commonwealth. But with the restoration of the monarchy, colonization began once again. In 1663, King Charles II granted 8 of his favorite supporters several million acres lying south of Virginia and stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. The gesture was both grand and calculated. France, Spain, Holland, and the Indian tribes who inhabited this area all laid claim to it, and Charles thought it would be wise to secure England's control of the region by colonizing it. The 8 new colonial proprietors named their colony Carolina to honor the king's late father, who had lost his head to the Puritan Commonwealth and whose name in Latin was Carolus, see map 3.3. The Carolina colony. The proprietors' plan for Carolina, called the Fundamental Constitution, was similar to Lord Baltimore's medieval dream. It was an elaborate blueprint for a society of great landowners, yeomen, which is small independent farmers, and serfs, or agricultural laborers, bound to work for their landlords. Like the Calverts, however, the Carolina proprietors discovered that few English people were willing to travel 3,000 miles across the ocean just to become serfs. Bowing to reality, the proprietors offered the incentive of the Headright system. Many of the early colonists in Carolina were planters relocating from the Caribbean island of Barbados, where sugar production supported a plantation economy, as further discussed in Chapter 4. They settled the southeastern portion of the colony, drawn there by the fine natural harbor of the port city Charlestown, later Charleston, and its fertile surroundings. Despite the dangers from the Spanish to the south in Florida and the Yamasee Indians to the southwest, Charlestown grew rapidly, becoming the most important city in the southern colonies. The early Carolinians experimented with several money-making activities, like trading with some Indians for captive victims of tribal warfare, whom the colonists sold as slaves in the Caribbean, and selling naval stores from their pine forests. Their first real success turned out to be cattle raising, a skill they learned from African slaves brought to the colony by the settlers from Barbados. But by the 1680s, rice cultivation became the road to riches. In 1719, Carolina's elite rice planters took control of the southern section of the colony from the original proprietors and named it South Carolina. These planters quickly became the richest English colonists on the mainland. The northern region of Carolina did not fare as well. Bordered by the Great Dismal Swamp, that is a proper noun, Great Dismal Swamp to the north, and by smaller swamps to the south, and with a chain of barrier islands blocking access to much of the coastline for ocean-going vessels, this isolated area attracted few colonists. Even so, some poor farm families and freed white indentured servants had drifted in from Virginia, searching for unclaimed land and a fresh start. They had modest success in growing tobacco and producing naval stores. In 1729, the North Carolina colonists followed the lead of their elite neighbors around Charleston and rid themselves of proprietary rule. They then officially separated from the rice-rich southern section of the colony. Thus, both South Carolina and North Carolina had become royal colonies. Georgia, the last colony. In 1732, James Oglethorpe, a wealthy English social reformer, and several of his friends requested a charter for a colony on the Florida border. Their goal was to provide a new moral life for English men and women imprisoned for minor debts. King George II had other motives for granting the charter, however. He was anxious to create a protective buffer state between the valuable rice-producing colony of South Carolina and the Spanish in Florida. He added a clause in the Georgia Charter requiring military service from every male settler. Thus, with one stroke of the pen, George II ensured that the poor men of Georgia would protect the rich men of South Carolina. The Georgia trustees believed that poverty was the result of a weak character or worse of an addiction to vice, and thus they did not think debtors could govern themselves. They forbade a representative assembly and denied the settlers a voice in selecting political leaders and military officers. They set other rules designed to reform the character of their colonists, including a ban on alcohol. To ensure that the settlers worked hard, they kept individual land grants small and banned the use of slave labor. Oglethorpe envisioned Georgia as a refuge for the deserving poor. Although he interviewed many imprisoned debtors, few met his standards. Instead, the colony slowly filled up with middle-class English immigrants and South Carolinians who were looking for new land. These colonists resented the trustees' paternalistic attitudes, and they soon challenged all the restrictive rules and regulations in the charter. They won the right to accumulate and sell land. They introduced slavery in defiance of the trustees. By 1752, Oglethorpe and his fellow trustees had lost enthusiasm for their reform project and, with relief, turned Georgia back over to the king. Individual voices. Nathaniel Bacon, Manifesto Concerning the Troubles in Virginia, 1676. Sometimes historical figures leave behind a clear statement of the motives and goals of their actions. Nathaniel Bacon is a good example. He was not setting down this information for future generations, of course. He was issuing a ringing statement of the grievances suffered by his followers, and his audience was the governor and his allies, English authorities, and loyal followers. The Declaration of the People was designed to persuade readers of the justice of the rebellion and to ensure that Bacon would be hailed as a defender of the people's rights and liberties rather than condemned as a traitor. If virtue be a sin, if piety be guilt, all the principles of morality, goodness, and justice be perverted, we must confess that those who are now called rebels may be in danger of those high imputations. Those loud and several bulls would affront innocence and render the defense of our brethren and the inquiry into our sad and heavy oppressions treason. But if there be, as sure there is, a just God to appeal to, if religion and justice be a sanctuary here, if to plead the cause of the oppressed, if sincerely to aim at his majesty's honor and do public good without any reservation or by interest, if to stand in the gap after so much blood of our dear brethren bought and sold, if after the loss of a great part of his majesty's colony deserted and dispeopled, freely with our lives and estates to endeavor to save the remainders be treason, God Almighty judge and let guilty die. But since we cannot in our hearts find one single spot of rebellion or treason, or that we have in any manner aimed at the subverting of the settled government or attempting of the person of either magistrate or private man, notwithstanding the several reproaches and threats of some who for sinister ends were disaffected to us and censured our innocent and honest designs, and since all people in all places where we have yet been can attest our civil, quiet, peaceable behavior far different from that of rebellion and tumultuous persons, let truth be bold and all the world know the real foundations of pretended guilt. Let us trace these men in authority in favor to whose hands the dispensation of the country's wealth has been committed. Basically, who's the rich people who are in charge and how are they benefiting? Let us observe the sudden rise of their estates composed with the quality in which they first entered this country, or the reputation that they have held here amongst wise and discerning men. And let us see whether their extractions in education have not been vile, and by what pretense of learning and virtue they would so soon come into employment of such great trust and consequence. Let us consider their sudden advancement, and let us also consider whether any public work for our safety and defense or for the advancement and propagation of trade, liberal arts, or sciences is here extant in any way adequate to our vast charge. Now let us compare these things together and see what sponges have sucked up the public treasure, and whether it has not been privately contrived away by unworthy favorites and juggling parasites, whose tottering fortunes have been repaired and supported at the public charge. Now if it be so, judge what greater guilt can be than to offer to pry into these and to unriddle the mysterious wiles of a powerful cabal. Let all people judge what can be of more dangerous import than to suspect the so long safe proceedings of some of our grandees, and whether people may with safety open their eyes in so nice a concern. Summary. In 1607, the English created their first permanent colony at Jamestown. By 1732, 13 English colonies hugged the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Some, like Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, were founded as religious refuges. Others were founded for profit. 4 distinct regions soon emerged, based primarily on how the settlers made their livings. Virginia and Maryland made up the Upper South. Here, tobacco shaped every aspect of life. Thousands of poor young Englishmen were brought over to work in the tobacco fields as indentured servants. They came as indentured servants, working without pay in exchange for passage to America. Few women were recruited, and the combination of an unbalanced sex ratio and frequent deaths caused by an unhealthy climate, grueling labor, and poor diet produced what historians call a demographic disaster in the 17th century Chesapeake. The colonies of the Lower South, the Carolinas and Georgia, were established many decades after the Chesapeake by two groups of wealthy Englishmen. Carolina's proprietors tried to create a feudal society, and Georgia's founders wanted to build a haven for debtors. In the end, however, neither goal was achieved. The settlers of what became South Carolina focused on rice production using African slave labor, and these planters became the richest group in the colonies. North Carolinians were poorer, growing tobacco and farming. Plymouth plantations, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and later New Hampshire made up the New England colonies with their small farms and shipping and lumbering industries. Here, the earliest settlers were dissenters who sought religious freedom. In 1620, separatists known as the Pilgrims founded the first New England colony, Plymouth Plantations. Their leaders drafted a radical document known as the Mayflower Compact, which assured broad political rights to all the men on board their ship, including the crew and the servants. In 1630, Massachusetts Bay was founded by Puritans who intended it to be a model Protestant community. They demanded conformity to their religious views and drove out those who challenged them, especially the Quakers. When Puritans like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchison challenged the colony's leadership and its religious practices, they too were exiled. Williams went on to found Rhode Island on the principle of separation of church and state. Other colonists left Massachusetts voluntarily and founded Connecticut. In 1691, Massachusetts was taken over by the king, and the Puritans' religious experiment ended. The anxiety produced by this political change, coupled with economic tensions and Indian attacks on the frontier, all contributed to the Salem witch hunts of 1691. The Middle Colonies region was initially settled by the Dutch and the Swedes, but the English seized the area in 1664. New Sweden and New Netherland became New Jersey and New York. In 1681, William Penn created the colony of Pennsylvania west of New Jersey as a home for Quakers. Unlike the Puritans, however, he welcomed people of all faiths into his holy experiment. The Middle Colonies were noted for their diverse populations and policies of religious toleration. Religious, economic, and political conflicts were common back in England, and it was often no more peaceful in the colonies. In Maryland, Protestants and Catholics warred with each other, and in Virginia, poor backcountry farmers, led by Nathaniel Bacon, rose up against the wealthier coastal planters in 1676. The desire for land also led to bloodshed. Land-hungry colonists in Virginia and New England made war against the Indians. Finally, English policies prompted rebellions as colonists in Boston and New York rose up to overthrow the hated Dominion of New England in 1689. As you're going to see in Chapter 4, most colonists continue to think of England as home even as they develop their own societies and their own institutions. Some developments, like widespread African slavery, would seem to widen the differences among the colonial regions. Some, like the rise of local representative government, would seem to bring them together. Slowly, however, colonists in all regions developed interests and goals that conflicted with the policies of England's government. One thing was certain: great changes would take place in the 18th century.